Okay, hello everyone, this is Eric Masalski, and in this tutorial we're going to be going over transforms. And transforms are basically moving, rotating, and scaling your objects. So if you go ahead and you open up the file that came with this tutorial, you'll see what we have here. Now the idea behind the scene is to take the various objects on the bottom and move them, rotate, and scale them so that they fit the appropriate guides on the top. But before we get into that, I'm going to do a quick introduction to Max's transforms as well as coordinate systems. Then we'll come back and walk through a couple of these. So if we select our cylinder, our second one, Max has a really neat feature where it allows you to hide everything but your current selection, and then quickly return everything, back. So if we press Alt-Q on the keyboard, you'll notice that it hid everything but my selection. I can now hit Exit Isolation Mode to bring everything back. So let's press Alt-Q with our cylinder selected, and let's also press the Maximize button so we can see all of our viewports. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to go over is the Move tool. The Move tool is at the top of the screen here, and you can use it to select an object. And when you click on an object that you want to move, you'll notice it brings up this little gizmo. This little gizmo is the coordinate system that you're currently using. And so you can click and drag on any one of these arrows to move it in a particular direction. You can click and drag in between two of the arrows to move it in those two directions or along that plane. And you'll notice that as I'm moving this, down here at the bottom, these numbers will change. See, as I'm moving it, it's telling me the relative position change. So right here I went up 29.892 units. Okay, and when you release the mouse, it gives you the absolute values. If you want, you can just click and drag in there and type in the explicit values if you want. You can also use these little spinners over here on the side. Now spinners are used in a couple ways. You can click on the arrows up and down, you can click and hold, or if you click and drag, it moves it much quicker. Now another option that you have is if you right click on one of these spinners, it zeroes it out. Okay, so just a really quick introduction to that. Now if you don't want to see your world coordinates up here, you can click on this little button to the left of them, and this changes it to relative. So if say you know that you only want to move 10 units from your current position, you can turn on relative and type in 10 along the x-axis. Then when you turn it off, our value increased by 10 units. Okay, so let's move on to rotation and scaling. Alright, so rotation is directly to the right of the Move tool. So if we click on that and then click on our object, you'll see that we have yet another gizmo here. So we can click and drag on any one of these circles to rotate the object along a particular axis. We can click and drag in the middle to freely rotate, or we can click and drag on this outer ring to rotate it in a screened aligned fashion. So if you'll notice in the perspective, it looks alright. It looks like it's just rotating in this view. But if we look at the top viewport, you can see that the rotations are actually quite complex. Okay, and then finally, we have scale. Scale has yet another set of another gizmo, but it operates basically in the same way. So if you click and drag on any one of these axes, you can scale it in that direction. You can also move the cursor over the little strip that joins up two axes to scale in those two directions, or you can move the cursor to the center of the gizmo and scale equally in all directions. Okay, so let's go over a couple things that you may run into when doing transforms. So if we jump over to our move tool, and if you look further down on the toolbar, you'll notice where a drop-down list called View. If you click on that, it lists all of the coordinate systems that you can use. So if we keep it on View, we select our object, you'll see that Z is going up, X to the right, and Y going back. Over here on the left, even though it's not our active viewport, it says Z going up, Y going this way, much like what we see here. However, if we switch viewports, you see that it changes. For moving in an orthographic view, and you have view coordinate system being used, Y will always be up and X will always be to the right. Now let's say we use the rotate tool and we rotate it a couple degrees. Doesn't really matter. You'll notice that our coordinate system didn't change at all. It's still upright because it's currently still aligned to the world. And as I rotate this along different axes, particularly the y-axis or the green, you notice it doesn't exactly rotate how I'd expect. So what we can do is we can change our coordinate system to that of the object, which is local. Now if you watch our coordinate system, you see that it's now aligned with our object. And we can now rotate it in a more intuitive way. If we go to the Move tool, you can see that it is currently set to view. And again, it's still axis aligned, or world aligned. If we change this to local, you can see how it changes. And so we can now move the cylinder along its own coordinate system. Now finally, with the Scale tool, if scale is set to view and your object is rotated, notice what happens when I scale along a particular axis. It skews. So what we definitely need to do in this case is we need to use local. And now we can scale it in a more intuitive way. Okay. So let's say that we use the rotation tool. We have our object selected. And if we look here in our left viewport, we can see where it's going to rotate around. It's basically where all of these circles intersect. Now say that's not where we want it to rotate. What we can do is we can change what's called the pivot point, or basically where the object's coordinate system originates from. And we do that from the hierarchy menu. The hierarchy menu is the third one in your tabs over here on the top right. So if we click on that and we choose Effect Pivot Only, it turns our pivot point into an object that we can move, rotate, and scale wherever we want. So in this case, I just moved it to the base of the cylinder, and I'm just checking it in my other views to make sure it's where I want it to be. When you're done, just turn off Effect Pivot Only and test it out. So you can see now it rotates around that point. It will also scale from that point. Okay, so very useful. Alright, so what we're going to do now is we're going to actually go through one of those exercises. So let's click on Exit Isolation Mode and Zoom Extents so we can see our entire scene. Now, the first thing when aligning objects is usually I change my coordinate system to world. just because I'm going to be using these orthographic views to initially line up my object. So I'm first going to go into the top view, click and drag the cylinder on top of this guide. They're nicely color-coded, so it's easy to see. Then I'm going to go over to my front view, because I can't really see too much over here on my left view. I'm going to use my front view and roughly drag it down. Okay, now on my perspective view, I'm going to zoom in to my cylinder and have a look at what's going on. Obviously, quite wrong. So I'm now going to rotate it and get it roughly going in the same direction. Now, one thing that you can use is, like, say over here on the left-hand side, you may not know which lines to be paying attention to for alignment. So you could just select an object in one of your other views where it's clearly shown, and then just look to see what highlights over here. So that's what I'm doing in this case. So I'm going back to my move tool, clicking and dragging it over to line it up inside the guide. And now I'm going to scale it to fit the correct size. So it's already set to local, which is great. And now to adjust the radius of this, if you notice, if I click and drag in the middle, it scales up the whole thing equally in all directions. Scale in one direction, sure, that could work if you then go to the X, but it's not really precise. You know, you're not exactly guaranteed that it's going to still be a circle up here at the top. But what we can do is we can click and drag on a little strip that combines the X and the Y. Now that we have this very, very close, using world coordinate system to move may be a little bit more cumbersome. So let's go to local and start tweaking this a little bit to try to get it lined up as best we can. Okay, so the idea isn't to obsess over, you know, like these little bits, but more so just to get the object to fit into its respective guide. So I recommend that you go through and you finish this exercise, and if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to contact me or post on the forums. I'll stress this again, it's very important that you understand transforms and coordinate systems. You're going to be using them throughout the rest of your experiments with this program. So I highly recommend you understand what is going on with this. Okay? Thank you. Have a good one.